On July 2nd, 1937, an aircraft went missing over the Pacific Ocean, and speculation as to what happened to that aircraft has been a matter of public obsession ever since. It is perhaps the modern mystery that has most absorbed the public's attention, but in all that discussion, something has been lost. There was not just one, but two important aviation pioneers on that Lockheed Electra that failed to reach Howland Island in July of 1937. And arguably the one that was much more important to the development of air travel is the one who seems to have become just a historical footnote. Columnist Arnold Mulder lamented in 1938 that doubtless the world has long forgotten that there was ever such a person as Fred Noonan. But Fred Noonan was much more than Amelia Earhart's navigator. He was a central figure in the development of commercial air travel, and he deserves to be remembered. On March 17, 1937, pilot Amelia Earhart set off on her attempt to fly around the world. Earhart was already world famous. In June of 1928, she'd become the first woman to fly nonstop across the Atlantic. She'd been asked along on the flight of the Fokker F-7 Friendship flight specifically to be the first woman to fly nonstop across the Atlantic, but despite being an accomplished pilot, she didn't participate in flying the plane and rode merely as a passenger. She described her role in the journey as being like a sack of potatoes. Unwilling to leave it at that, in May of 1932, she piloted a Lockheed Vega from Harbour Grace, Newfoundland, to Londonderry, Northern Ireland, making her the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean nonstop, and only the second person to do so after Charles Lindbergh. The resulting fame offered her opportunity. In April of 1936, Purdue University provided a fund of over $50,000 for aeronautical research that included what the New York Times described as a flying laboratory, a Lockheed Electra. Earhart decided that she would use the plane to fly around the world. The Purdue University website writes that during preparations, Earhart was asked numerous times why she decided to attempt this flight, and her answer was always, "Because I want to." She called the trip a shining adventure, beckoning with new experiences, adding knowledge of flying, of peoples, of myself. The attempt was to fly around the world close to the equator. Although it would not have been the first around-the-world flight, it would have been the longest to date, and the first by a female pilot. In addition, she planned to compile her notes into a book, part of the proceeds of which would go to the university. Her first attempt was to fly her route going east. Originally, the flight was only to include her and a navigator who would only accompany her across the Pacific, where they had to navigate to small islands. But that navigator was not Fred Noonan. Rather, it was a steamship captain named Henry Manning. Manning and Earhart had met in 1928, when he had been sailing master aboard the SS President Harding, on which she had returned to the United States after her transatlantic flight. By 1926, he was a captain sailing with the United States Lines, and he was also an accomplished aviator. He requested and was given a leave of absence from the line to take part in Earhart's flight. In his 1966 book, The Search for Amelia Earhart, author Fred Gorner writes that Manning, a Congressional Medal of Honor recipient for having heroically rescued 32 men from the steamship Florida, was considered one of the finest navigators in the world. But when she took off, there were 4 crew aboard on March 14, 1937. In addition to Earhart and Manning, she took with her air racing pilot Paul Mantz, there as a technical advisor on long-distance flying, and another navigator, Fred Noonan. Noonan was, like Harry Manning, a captain in the Merchant Marine as well as an aviator. The reason for including 2 navigators wasn't clear. Some speculate that there was a question regarding Manning's navigation skills, and Gerner simply writes that the 2 navigators were included because of the complexity of flying across the Pacific, noting that in aerial navigation, Noonan was more experienced than Manning. In any case, the original plan had Noonan leaving the flight at Howland Island, and then Manning leaving the flight once it reached Australia. The Pacific conquered, Earhart would then continue for the rest of the flight alone. Gerner writes that the flight to Honolulu was perfect. 15 hours and 52 minutes after leaving Oakland, Amelia landed the Lockheed at Wheeler Field. 3 days later, Mantz, having seen to the maintenance and preparation of the plane, stayed in Honolulu, and Earhart, Manning, and Noonan took off for the next destination, tiny Howland Island. But the plane didn't make it off the ground. A U.S. Army Board of Investigation later determined. On reaching the end, Miss Earhart turned and, after a brief delay, opened both throttles. As the airplane garnered speed, it swung slightly to the right. Miss Earhart corrected this tendency by throttling the left-hand motor. The airplane then began to swing to the left with increasing speed, characteristic of a ground loop. It tilted outward, right wing low, and for 50 to 60 feet was supported by the right wheel only. The right-hand landing gear suddenly collapsed under this excessive load, followed by the left. The airplane spun sharply to the left on its belly amid a shower of sparks, and came to rest headed about 200 degrees from its initial course. There was no fire. Miss Earhart and her crew emerged unhurt. While the crew was unhurt and the Lockheed salvageable, it could not continue immediately. The plane was shipped back to California on a passenger liner for repairs. Manning's leave from the steamship line was about to expire, and he decided he must return to his ship, although there may have been another reason for leaving. As aviation author and aircraft historian William Patrick Dean explains on his website, after the crash in Hawaii, Manning later said, "I had no faith in her ability as a pilot." But Gerner writes Fred Noonan elected to continue. Amelia liked the tall, dark Irishman who, in 44 years, had adventured enough for a dozen men. The website The Earhart Project writes, little is known about Fred's early life. No information on other siblings has been uncovered, suggesting that he was an only child. However, his childhood must have been dramatically affected by the tragic death of his mother, which occurred just 2 months before his 4th birthday in 1897. Noonan's life after his mother passed is unclear, but as early as 1905, at the age of 12, he left home for Seattle, Washington, and sometime thereafter became a merchant seaman. The Miami Herald wrote in 1935, young Fred Noonan ran away from home when he was a boy to go to sea. The Earhart Project notes that he was aboard the bark Hecla sometime before 1910 and listed as an able seaman on the bark Crompton in 1910. The Herald writes that he spent 7 years on sailing ships as ship's apprentice and on up through the ranks to chief officer and master mariner. He served on vessels under the American, British, German, French, and Norwegian flags. The Pacific Ocean is familiar territory to him due to his many crossings to the Orient. Not only did Earhart's navigator know the Pacific, he already had been around the world. The Herald writes, master mariner, unlimited for ships of any tonnage, navigating any seas, Noonan has sailed around the world so many times that he's actually lost count. He rounded the Horn 7 times, 3 times on sailing vessels and 4 in steamships before the Panama Canal was completed. But he wasn't just a mariner, he was also an accomplished aviator. Dean writes that he took up aviation in the late 1920s, possibly as a new career following his marriage in 1927. He attained a commercial pilot's license in 1930. Dean writes his intent was not necessarily to be a pilot, but to become a long-distance aerial navigator. His knowledge of marine navigation was unsurpassed. To that end, he had gotten work with the New York Rio Buenos Aires airline, which was then acquired by Pan American Airlines. There he had thrived. The Herald writes that in 1935 he was serving as assistant airport manager in Miami. He has served as instructor in aerial navigation to pilots in Miami and previous to that time served for many years at Port-au-Prince, Haiti. By celestial navigation, he established the correct geographical positions of various ground stations on Pan America's Caribbean routes. It was, the Herald explained, due to his 22 years of serving on the high seas, covering every phase of ocean travel and navigation, that he was selected as the navigation officer on a history-making flight in a Pan Am Sikorsky S-42 Clipper under the command of Captain Edward C. Musick. This flight, the Herald writes, establishing for all time the fact that aircraft weighing tons can connect Hawaii with California easily in 17 hours and can squeeze the vast Pacific into 5 days flying time between the United States and the Orient. Dean notes that this was a time when it was not thought possible to fly the 2,400 miles across the Pacific. The San Bernardino County Sun noted the significance of the flight. Noonan revealed that 23 years ago he traveled to Hawaii as second officer aboard the barkentine Aurora. The voyage took 17 days that time, he mused. Last week, I made it in 17 hours. The Herald was impressed. Such trips as the one this crew of veterans of the air and sea have just made from San Francisco to Honolulu didn't just happen. Every pioneer pilot who risked his neck and often gave his life, every mechanic and airplane builder from the Wright brothers and their little bicycle shop in Dayton, and Glenn Curtiss, who built the first flying boats, to Igor Sikorsky, the quiet, unassuming adopted son of Russia who designed and built the ocean-going flying clipper ships, contributed to the clock-like conquest of the Pacific by a swift and sure 19-ton ship of the air. The flight and the crew, including Noonan, had made national headlines and were placed among pioneers like Orville and Wilbur Wright, Glenn Curtiss, and Igor Sikorsky. Not only had they made this fabulous flight, but the Honolulu Star-Advertiser reported the crew would be tasked with mapping all of the territory across the Pacific to allow regular commercial travel across the vast ocean. Journalist Mike Campbell writes on his blog, Amelia Earhart, The Truth at Last, Noonan was subsequently responsible for mapping Pan Am's clipper routes across the Pacific Ocean, participating in many flights to Midway Island, Wake Island, Guam, the Philippines, and Hong Kong. In 1936, the Corning, California Daily Observer wrote of these flights as something that might have been prescient for Amelia Earhart. Thanks to these and other pioneering flights, you will soon be able to fly around the world. In 1937, Noonan left Pan Am. Genealogy.com writes 1937 was a year of transition for Fred Noonan, whose reputation as an expert navigator, along with his role in the development of commercial airline navigation, had already earned him a place in aviation history. The tall, very thin, dark auburn hair and blue-eyed 43-year-old navigator was living in Los Angeles. He resigned from Pan Am because he felt that he had risen through the ranks as far as he could as a navigator and had interest in starting a navigation school. If that was his intention, then clearly accompanying Earhart on her highly publicized flight would have been good for business. Genealogy.com continues. Amelia Earhart met Noonan through mutual connections in the Los Angeles aviation community and chose him to serve as her navigator on her world flight in the Lockheed Electra 10E that she had purchased, with funds donated by Purdue University. Noonan was probably attracted to the project because Earhart's mass-market fame would almost certainly generate huge publicity, which in turn could reasonably be expected to attract attention to him and the navigation school that he hoped to establish when they returned. But to go along, there were limits. The flight was less science than stunt. Genealogy.com explains, although the aircraft was an advanced type and dubbed a flying laboratory for the press, little real science was planned. The world was already crisscrossed with commercial airline routes, many of which Noonan himself had first navigated and mapped, and the flight is now widely regarded as an adventurous publicity stunt. Earhart's husband was publisher and promoter George Putnam. The purpose of the flight was to promote Amelia and her book, and Noonan would have to take a back seat, figuratively, if not literally, and that might be part of the reason that Noonan, despite being frankly more experienced and more central to the development of around-the-world aviation, has spent so much time in Earhart's shadow. For whatever reason, though, the man who would now accompany Amelia Earhart on her second attempt to make a round-the-world flight was, Dean notes, one of the top, if not the best, navigators in the world. On the second attempt, Earhart decided to fly east instead of west, and although the original idea had been to include Noonan only for the route across the Pacific, Amelia decided to include him for the entire trip. The two departed Miami on June 1st and traveled without significant incident across South America, Africa, India, and Southeast Asia, some 22,000 miles. They arrived in Lae, New Guinea, on June 29th. Their next stop would be Howland Island, which is where they were supposed to have been heading the previous March when she crashed in Honolulu. Genealogy.com writes, Earhart characterized the pace of their 40-day eastward trip from Burbank to New Guinea as leisurely. They took off from Lae on 2 July 1937 and headed for Howland Island, a tiny sliver of land in the Pacific Ocean, barely 2,000 meters long. The plan for the 18-hour flight was to reach the vicinity of Howland using Noonan's celestial navigation skills, and then find the island using radio navigation signals sent by the United States Coast Guard cutter Itasca. Through a series of misunderstandings or mishaps which are still controversial over scattered clouds, the final approach was never accomplished, although Earhart indicated by radio that they believed that they were in the immediate vicinity of Howland. Two-way radio contact was never established, and the flyers disappeared over the western Pacific. Despite an unprecedented extended search by the U.S. Navy and Coast Guard, no physical evidence was found. There are, of course, many theories as to what happened to that aircraft that was carrying Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan, and despite new discoveries every year, there's still no definitive answer. Some of those theories do deal with Fred Noonan, arguing that he was a heavy drinker and might have been drunk or hungover, which was dangerous on a day where they had to find Howland Island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. But the video and photo of him boarding the plane with Amelia Earhart in Lae show him chipper and smiling, and people that flew with him said that he never flew while intoxicated. The accident in March, however, looms large. Had the plane not crashed when she was leaving Honolulu, then she would have been flying to Howland Island not with one, but with two navigators. And one of those, Manning, was more experienced with the radio, might have been better able to make a connection with the Coast Guard. It's possible that had the plane not crashed in Hawaii, that they would have made it safely to Howland Island, that Noonan and Manning would have left the flight in Australia as planned, and that Earhart would have completed her flight around the world. And two, if Manning hadn't decided to leave the project after that crash, then it might have been him and not Noonan who went missing in July And also a tragedy. Fred Noonan, who played such an important role in allowing around-the-world air travel, is largely remembered only as Amelia Earhart's navigator. Mike Campbell writes, if you search on Amazon for Fred Noonan, Amelia's navigator during the World War II flight attempt up to and including their unsuccessful lay to Howland leg, you'll find just 142 results. Of these books, none were written solely about him. I repeat, not one single biography has ever been written about Fred Noonan. This is a tragedy, as Mulder wrote in his column in the Green Bay Press Gazette in 1938. For if the facts were regarded objectively, Fred Noonan was as worthy of praise as was Amelia Earhart. He faced every risk that she faced, and he is just as dead as she is. He was young and had life ahead of him, and he loved his family as much as she did hers. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.